So I'm Andy Davidson, I work for Hampshire Countryside Service and I'm the Nature Recovery Officer. So we're down today at our Lymington and Keyhaven Reserve, and actually this is called Normandy Lagoon. Well, terns are a group, they're almost like gulls in appearance, but they're normally narrow pointed wings. Some people call them sea swallows because they've got like a forked tail and they fly quite low, quite like a swallow dipping across the water. Tend to be white and grey, and the colour of the bill is the way to tell most of them apart. So you get common terns, which have got an orangey red bill with a black tip. There's the much bigger sandwich tern, which has got a black bill with a yellow tip. And then you've got the little tern, which is one of the smallest terns in the world, and that's got a yellow bill with a black tip. They're very scarce. I mean, they're under huge pressure, really, because partly where they like to breed and some of the pressures on here, because we're standing next to the lagoon here. Behind us is the sea wall on this side. So actually quite often we're below sea level here. The sea level will rise up at the other side of the sea wall. And there's a footpath along here as well. It was called Lymington and Keyhaven Reserve. It runs from Keyhaven from that side up to Lymington, which is just over here beyond the masts. And several 100,000 people walk on this every year. So there's all sorts of pressures. And actually quite often these birds would have been nesting on the shore, on the beach. But those are the sort of place where people like to stop and walk. So if they can get into something like here, we've got these low islands in here in the lagoon itself. So they're breeding out on those low islands. And their chicks, and eggs and chicks, are very well camouflaged. I mean, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can easily stand them because they look like pebbles, the eggs. And also the chicks are very well camouflaged. They're sort of lichen and stone coloured. So if they're crouching down, they can be very difficult to see. You know, some of the terns nest out on the offshore islands, but they have to worry about paddle boarders and canoeists stopping off. And they would normally be on the shingle spits around here, but that's where the people walk. So there's a huge amount of disturbance, a lot of pressure on these areas for access. Now they get used to people on these bits because, you know, say there could be hundreds of thousands of people on this path every year, but there's a big ditch and there's a fence. So you can see birds just over the fence, which is really quite nice. They become what we call habituated because they understand that, well, unless I really go for it, I'm not going to go through that really. So there's a little tern coming straight across the top of us now. You know, so they mainly breed on the islands and feed out in the water. So you'll see them flapping about, hovering sometimes and then dipping down and catching the fish that are just underneath the water. And then you can see them bringing back in to feed the chicks that are on these islands. And there are several out there at the moment. So we've got clearly some of the European legislation still hanging over. Under those they'll be called what we call an Annex 1 species. A lot of these species will end up with what we call species conservation strategies, and they'll be agreed nationally. We know the little terns is declining, it's vulnerable, so there will be one for them. So it's things like protecting the breeding sites. This electric fence around here was part funded by the RSPB. They helped support us put it in. Now this is a really important area for a lot of wintering birds, but also breeding species. So these will be protected as SPAs for the wintering brink geese, a lot of waders, but also in the summer a lot of the tern species. The islands out there, you can see these little shingle islands. Vegetation does like to grow on them. And if it gets too tall, then the terns won't like it out there because they need to get to the shingle to nest on. So during the winter, we'll get volunteers out pulling all that up. So they remain as these low shingle banks with a bit of vegetation as cover, and occasionally you might see these sort of, looks like half a drain pipe out there, and that's so the little terns can the chicks can sort of snuggle underneath them. There's a bit of extra protection. But little terns are just part of the whole sequences of habitats and species that are on this coast. I mean, Lymington and Keyhaven in particular, as a nature reserve, is well known for its these lagoons. So these are saline lagoons. So they're not strictly seawater, they're not quite freshwater, and that will vary as you go down. Some will be a bit more fresh, some will be slightly more salty. And there's actually some really obscure little species which only occur in these saline lagoons. Things like Dumoulin's world snail and the starlet sea anemone. And you know, there's a few of these obscure but quite nice little species which you'll probably never see. And these are the only place they live. lot of the pressures is footfall and where people walk. So in this area called Bird-aware Solent, but they have rangers walking along the coast trying to talk to people and explain, you know, because quite often, I say, things like little terns, and we're breeding on the shingle, they are supposed to be pretty invisible, you know, so you can't blame people for not seeing them. But being aware where things are and where they might be nesting, so sometimes we might put a fence up with the same breeding birds, ask people to respect those, really, and just be a little bit, well, bird aware is very much part of the message of Bird-aware Solent. So we're going to be asking a lot of people to get involved in our surveys. It's a great example of citizen science. You know, and you don't necessarily need to be an expert. Some people might become experts in the long run, but you don't need to be an expert quite often. They can get involved in some of the management, volunteers with the various organisations, and do activities like come and cut the weeds on these little islands, or cut scrub on the banks and things like that. And also we do surveys of the grasslands and things like that to make sure they're the right structure. So there's a wealth of ways you can get involved and help out with this. We've got an online system for volunteers, and we're going to be putting more and more as we go through it, as opportunities arise. And it might be, I mean, you might not be into birds, you might be into plants, you might be into heritage. Or if you're into computers, you know, you might end up entering the data on the system for us not counting. So we're not just looking for people who only want to get out and cut things down. So really, any way you can get involved.